I'd like to thank Josh Meservey for agreeing to chat with us today about the unfolding situation in South Africa relating in particular to the Expropriation Act. The Expropriation Act was one of the issues that President Trump listed in his executive order of the 7th of February this year. In fact, it was the first one. And we know that the United States is interested and concerned about the possibility of expropriation without compensation in South Africa. And the situation has actually become more serious in the last week because President Ramaphosa visited Zimbabwe. And while he was there, he endorsed what the Zimbabweans had done in grabbing land from the owners of property in Zimbabwe, despite the catastrophic consequences of that action. His reaction was, it was therefore essential for both historical redress and food security, development and economic growth, that the government embarked on ambitious reforms to facilitate the entry of Black Zimbabweans into productive agriculture. So this is a major concern to us because it may signal the ANC's intention to really start implementing expropriation without compensation in South Africa. Josh, we'd like to hear your views of what the United States reaction to this will be, and the response of the Trump administration to a development so contrary to the warning that was issued on the 7th of February.
Well, first, thanks so much for having me, and glad to participate virtually here. Yeah, I think the irony really of those comments in Zimbabwe is that they confirmed for some people in the United States fears that they'd had around this expropriation without compensation legislation in South Africa. And when critics of EWC here in the US invoked the Zimbabwe example, we were told by South African officials or others who defended that legislation that was an erroneous comparison and it was foolish to be concerned about such things. It was very, very different. So now you have, as you referenced and you read some of the comments, President Ramaphosa going to Zimbabwe and praising those exact farm invasions is, I think, the most accurate way to characterize what happened in Zimbabwe. That had catastrophic economic effects, that plunged Zimbabwe from, or degraded Zimbabwe from being a breadbasket of Southern Africa to being a basket case in the region. Now, you can still argue that there are substantive differences between the current situation in South Africa and Zimbabwe, and I accept those arguments, but I think the fundamental concern around EWC from an American perspective, from a U.S. government perspective, maybe, I'm not in the U.S. government, but I try to channel what people in the government think, is that EWC gives a South African government which is dominated by a party, the ANC, an immense amount of power that the ANC, unfortunately, has not proven to be able to handle competently or appropriately. This is a party that has a long history of profound corruption. It is a party that in its documents discusses or lauds redistribution, socialism. One of its partners is the South African Communist Party, which of course would, as communists everywhere have always done, would very happily abolish all property rights if they could. So then they would, be able to control as much power as possible. So it really, I think it affirmed, President Ramaphosa's comments in Zimbabwe actually affirm some of the fears that people have had, or concerns here in the United States that people have had about EWC.
Now, one of the things that President Trump said in his statement of the 7th of February was his concern about the impact that EWC would have on Afrikaner farmers. But we think it's really important for people in the United States to understand that this is something that will affect all South Africans. Just the way that the seizure of farms in Zimbabwe had a catastrophic impact on the well-being of everybody in Zimbabwe except those who were in government. We're really worried about it because it isn't just agricultural land, it can be any property. And we are particularly worried about this because one of the positive things about South Africa is the high level of home ownership among Black South Africans. There are 9 million Black South African households that own their own property. We're not talking about shacks. We're talking about brick and mortar houses. And this will also be a blow to their basic property rights. So how do you feel, and how do you think the United States will feel about these broader economic implications of EWC if it is now implemented seriously?
Yeah, I think it would be of immense concern to the United States. So most immediately, it would affect American companies. There are hundreds of American companies that are invested in South Africa, that operate in South Africa. And as you pointed out, the language is very broad and vague in key parts of this legislation. So it is not land, it is property that is discussed as being potentially subject to EWC. Property could mean anything. And that could include American company property. Why not? If South Africa really chooses to go down this road. Now I've heard the counter arguments and okay, but again, it's about the potential here. People say EWC has never been used. Okay, fine, but it still gives the government the power to do it if it wishes. And if you're an investor, an American investor, it dramatically increases the risks associated with operating in South Africa, the potential risks. And if you're the American government, then it makes you very uncomfortable and nervous about the prospect that some of the companies from your country could be subjected to this type of extremely unfair seizures of property. So that's the most immediate concern, I would say, for the US government. But yes, beyond that, there would be concern that it would have massive negative economic repercussions in South Africa, but also throughout the region of Southern Africa. South Africa obviously drives the regional economy in some key ways. It's certainly the entry point into Southern Africa. So if there is really serious widespread EWC in South Africa, the repercussions would extend far beyond the borders of South Africa itself. It would be bad in South Africa, absolutely, and it would make it essentially impossible for American companies, I think, to invest in the country, and but it would also have much broader effects. So these are hypotheticals, but I think when you are a policymaker in the US government, you have to deal in hypotheticals sometimes. You have to try to prognosticate out into the future if you're doing your job properly. So even though EWC has never been invoked, it's a recent, this nil compensation clause is a recent development, but it would be foolish and irresponsible of American policymakers to not think about the possible long-term repercussions of this.
Another problem that President Trump addressed in the executive order on the 7th of February was South Africa's racial legislation. Now, you might also have known that this week, the draconian regulations under the Employment Equity Act came into effect in South Africa that prescribe quotas, minimum quotas that companies will have to reach in terms of their employment practices in the coming 5 years. And these will limit the opportunities for minorities, particularly, to their share of the demographic population. It means that many tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of white South Africans and Indians will no longer be able to work in big companies because they will exceed the quota that is prescribed for them in this legislation. So this is another example of how the ANC government, or it's not an ANC government, it's supposed to be a GNU government, but how the ANC is simply ignoring everything that all the messages that President Trump sent on the 7th of February.
First, it sends a very negative message about the ANC's competence and their economic theories and just their worldview. Because the idea that implementing strict quotas of this type, one, could possibly be effective or not have very serious economic downsides associated with them is crazy. But it also touches on domestic political issues here in the United States. It's somewhat triggering, let's say, for the Trump administration, because the Trump movement was animated in part by a fear that the meritocracy in the United States was under assault by forces that subscribe to the same types of ideas that animate these quotas that you're discussing now. In South Africa, there's absolutely people here in the US who would think that's a great idea. To impose quotas on companies in the U.S. Racial quotas of the same type that South Africa is now facing, and this really became this movement that I'm referencing in the United States. Been around for a long time, this worldview, but it really came into its own, let's say, during the previous administration under President Biden, where the federal government started to institutionalize preferential hiring practices, for instance, based on race and sometimes sexual orientation. And the Trump movement, I think, rightly viewed this as an assault on the system that made the United States the largest global and economic power. Economic and military power. It was a direct assault on that system and an attempt to sort of radically restructure American society as well. So that has immense resonance within the Trump movement. So when the Trump administration sees a country like South Africa imposing things like racial quotas, it's a problem for the administration, not just because of the obvious issues it will create in South Africa, how it will disadvantage minorities, how it will have very negative economic repercussions, but also because it sort of triggers the Trump administration, because it's fighting some of these same fights here in the United States and is deeply concerned about some of these same trends in the US. So it has a certain resonance within the Trump administration that beyond just the surface problems. And again, the quota idea, I said at the very beginning, it reflects badly on the ANC's competence and understanding of economics and society, because the idea that all demographic groups have the exact same levels of educational attainment, the same age, this is something we hear frequently in the United States. People will compare the average income of the white population with the average income of the Black population. And since the former is higher than the latter, they'll say, well, that's obviously a sign of some sort of discrimination or whatever. But when you do a univariate analysis like that, it's massively simplistic and misses some useful and actually essential nuances. So in this case, in the United States, the white population is significantly older. The average age in the United States of the white population is significantly older than the black population. So that, and older people, almost always have more wealth. So I say that to demonstrate that I think this very, very simplistic and sort of crude approach of quotas is entirely wrongheaded, and again reflects poorly on the South African government and the ANC if they believe that this is somehow the way either to redress economic problems, or even worse, if they think this is somehow a way to redress racial problems. You do not get rid of racial animus and racial discrimination through further racial animus and racial discrimination. That is not the way you solve these things. You stop using racial animus and you stop using racial discrimination. That's how you end those things. So it's a very strange approach and argument that you can, get rid of a poison by pouring on more poison. So that's why I say this reflects very poorly on the ANC, how it views the world, and it genuinely concerns the Trump administration because they believe, again, I think rightly, that they are fighting some of the same battles here in the United States.
Yeah, Josh, I think you're right. There's one great law that no government or anybody in the world can repeal, and that is that if you appoint and promote people on any basis other than merit, you will drive merit out of your organization. A third concern, maybe the underlying concern that President Trump expressed on the 7th of February, was the hostile approach that South Africa has increasingly adopted to the United States and to its allies. Recently, there have been further developments. As you know, our General Mapwanya, the head of the South African Defense Force, visited Iran, and he expressed solidarity with the Iranian revolution and the Iranian position on the Middle East. His views were repudiated by the president and by the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, but nevertheless, no action has been taken against him. And also, the South African National Defense Force is planning to hold joint military exercises with China and Russia at the very time that the G20 summit is scheduled to be held in South Africa in November this year. What on earth is the reaction of the United States going to be to that?
Well, it would be very negative. I would be stunned if President Trump would agree to go to the G20 when those. I'm not sure he would even go now. I doubt it, frankly, but perhaps he might. But certainly, if there's joint exercises being conducted with, the Chinese and Russian armed forces at the very same time the G20 summit is being held, it would be very hard to interpret that as anything other than a very obvious insult, to the United States specifically, but even other, Western countries that, would be participating. Yeah, it's we don't even have time to go through all of the provocations that it's almost a relentless drip, drip, drip of provocations from South Africa from the American perspective. Even as South African delegations travel to the United States, government delegations travel to the United States, and so I was just making the point that the South African government will say that it wants better relations with the United States, but then at the same time, its actions suggest strongly otherwise. You referenced General Mapwanya's visit to Iran, and then again these joint exercises. These are just two of the most recent examples. There's many others. So it's very hard, I think, for Washington to take the South African government seriously when it says it wants better relations, yet continues on with these provocations. There's a new one practically every week, it feels like. So I think unless the South African government and the ANC take substantive, even hard decisions, that political decisions that will help renew this relationship with the U.S., I think we're there will be further deterioration. And again, I would be very surprised if President Trump participated in the G20 in South Africa.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your comments and for the insight you've given us into the way the US is looking at these developments in South Africa, and particularly with regard to the Expropriation Act. We, I think, in South Africa are very grateful for the concern that has been shown on these issues by the world's leading democracy. So more you can do to spread the word in the United States, the better. Thank you so much.
No, it's my pleasure, Dave. Thanks for having me. And may I say, as I frequently do, these critiques come from a place of sadness that this is what the relationship has become between the US and South Africa. South Africa is a wonderful country, and I think everybody I talk to in the US wants a better relationship with the country, but the strong sense is that normal diplomatic engagements do not work. We've tried them even for decades, and things have only gotten worse and worse. So until there's substantive change on political issues from the South African government, the US will feel like it has no choice but to continue piling up pressure on South Africa, unfortunately.